The year was 793 CE, and the monastery of Lindisfarne slept beneath the pale glow of the northern moon. Inside its stone walls, monks chanted in quiet devotion, their voices mingling with the distant roar of the sea. To them, the world beyond was simple: holy men and kings, kingdoms rising and falling, but always distant, always separate from their sacred island. But that night, as the tides shifted, an invisible war reached its climax. Long before the dragon-headed ships appeared on the horizon, Viking spies were already here. Posing as merchants, pilgrims, and even humble servants, they had walked among these very monks for months, learning their routines, mapping their defenses, and discovering exactly where the gold and holy relics were kept. By the time the raiders arrived with their axes and shields, there would be no resistance, no confusion, only shock and slaughter. This was no chaotic invasion. It was precision warfare, planned not on the battlefield, but in the shadows. Before we unravel the secrets of the Viking spy network, take a moment to join our growing community of history hunters and truth seekers. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Comment below. It's always incredible to see viewers from around the world united by these ancient mysteries. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Ancient Spy Files to keep these hidden stories alive. Your support allows us to dive deeper into the untold history that shaped the world. For centuries, the Vikings have been remembered as wild, unpredictable warriors, raiders who struck without warning, burning villages and leaving nothing but ash and legend in their wake. In popular imagination, their attacks were driven by brute strength and primal fury, not strategy or subtlety. But recent research tells a very different story. The truth is that the Vikings were far more organized and intelligent than history gives them credit for. Behind every raid, every sudden strike along the coastlines of England, France, or Ireland, there was careful planning, months, sometimes even years, of preparation. The Vikings didn't just sail blindly into enemy territory. They knew exactly where to strike, when the enemy would be most vulnerable, and which targets would yield the greatest reward. And how did they acquire this knowledge? Through spies, men and women who infiltrated foreign lands, lived among their enemies, and fed crucial intelligence back to the Norse warlords. While the warriors gained glory on the battlefield, it was these hidden agents who made victory possible. To understand the brilliance of the Viking spy network, we must first understand the world they lived in. The Viking Age was a time of fractured kingdoms and shifting alliances. Europe was divided into countless small realms, each with its own rulers, laws, and defenses. Communication between these realms was slow and unreliable, making it difficult for them to unite against a common threat. This chaos was a perfect breeding ground for espionage. A single spy could move freely between borders under the guise of trade or pilgrimage, gathering intelligence without raising suspicion. And unlike their later medieval counterparts, Viking spies operated in a world with no centralized intelligence systems, meaning their enemies had no way of tracking them. They were ghosts, moving through villages and courts unseen, leaving only rumors in their wake. At the same time, the Vikings themselves were masters of deception. They were not just raiders but traders, establishing vast commercial networks that stretched from Scandinavia to Byzantium and even the Middle East. These trading routes provided the perfect cover for espionage. A Norse merchant could spend years in a foreign port, learning local politics and defenses, all while quietly sending reports back to his homeland. Consider again the attack on Lindisfarne, often called the beginning of the Viking Age. To most historians, it appears as a sudden, brutal raid, the dawn of chaos sweeping across Europe. But look closer, and you'll see the signs of careful preparation. The raiders knew exactly when the monastery would be at its weakest, which valuables were hidden within its vaults, and even which monks could be ransomed for the highest price. This wasn't luck. It was the result of months of covert work, spies quietly gathering intelligence while posing as pilgrims seeking blessings or merchants offering goods. These spies would study tides, weather patterns, and even local superstitions to ensure their warriors had every possible advantage. When the longships finally appeared, it was not the beginning of the operation. It was the end. The real battle had already been fought in silence, and it had been won long before the first sword was drawn. The Vikings' greatest strength was their mobility. Their ships allowed them to strike deep into enemy territory, but this mobility also came with risks. A single miscalculation, a wrong tide, a fortified village, a well-prepared enemy could spell disaster for an entire raiding party. That's where the spies came in. They acted as living maps and messengers, ensuring the warlords knew not only where to strike, but when to retreat. Some spies even sabotaged enemy defenses ahead of an attack, cutting watchtower ropes or bribing gatekeepers to ensure a smooth escape. Others specialized in psychological warfare, spreading rumors of ghostly Viking ships or unstoppable armies to sow fear long before the raiders arrived. By the time the warriors appeared, many villages were too terrified to fight back. What made the Viking spy network truly remarkable was how invisible it was. Unlike later medieval spies, who often operated through royal courts or military orders, the Vikings used ordinary people. Traders, slaves, mercenaries, and even wandering storytellers could all serve as agents of intelligence. Their cover stories were so convincing that even if captured, they appeared harmless. In some cases, Viking spies would live undercover for years, raising families, building businesses, and becoming trusted members of foreign communities. Their loyalty lay not with the lands they lived in, but with the chieftains and jarls who commanded them from afar. When the time came, these deep cover operatives could signal an invasion force, open gates from the inside, or quietly eliminate key targets before a raid began. By the end of the 9th century, the Vikings had become the terror of Europe. Their sudden strikes seemed almost supernatural, as if they could appear anywhere at any time. In truth, this perception was carefully cultivated by their spy network. They wanted their enemies to believe they were unstoppable, because fear itself was a weapon. This hidden hand shaped the history of entire regions. Some kingdoms fell not because of overwhelming Viking numbers, but because their leaders were misled by false information. Others survived only because they unknowingly served Viking interests, manipulated by agents who controlled the flow of news and rumor. The Vikings didn't just fight on the seas and battlefields. They fought in the minds of their enemies, using intelligence and deception to achieve victories that brute strength alone could never deliver. In this chapter, we've torn away the myth of the wild, chaotic Viking raider to reveal a far more chilling truth. The Norse were not just warriors. They were strategists, masters of espionage, who wielded secrets as skillfully as swords. But this is only the beginning. In the next chapter, we will step deeper into their world, exploring the recruitment, training, and daring missions of the Viking spies themselves. You'll meet the shadowy figures who moved unseen through medieval Europe, and uncover the methods they used to outsmart kings and armies alike. The next time you see a Viking longship cutting through the mist, remember this: it is not the warriors you should fear most. It is the whisperers, the hidden agents whose work ensures that by the time the raid begins, the battle has already been won. When most people think of Vikings, they imagine roaring warriors charging from their longships, axes swinging, shields crashing, a storm of chaos unleashed on defenseless towns. But the true power of the Vikings lay in silence, in the men and women who moved unseen, preparing the way for those roaring warriors. Before the first horn sounded or the first blade was drawn, spies had already ensured the battle's outcome. These were the hidden architects of conquest, the shadow agents who made Viking raids seem almost supernatural. Their existence was so secretive that even many Viking warriors never knew they were being guided by unseen hands. In the smoky halls of Norse chieftains, when victories were toasted with mead, few realized that the glory of the battlefield truly belonged to those who never set foot on it. The Vikings didn't have formal spy schools or written codes of recruitment. Instead, their intelligence network grew organically, shaped by necessity and opportunity. At the heart of this process were the traders, the lifeblood of Viking society. Viking traders were unlike any others of their age. They traveled vast distances, carrying furs, amber, iron, and even slaves across Europe and Asia. These journeys exposed them to countless cultures and languages, giving them natural cover for espionage. A trader could enter a foreign port without suspicion, mingle with locals, and learn about defenses, politics, and wealth distribution. Chieftains and jarls would carefully select individuals from among these traders, often men and women with sharp wits and sharp tongues who could blend seamlessly into foreign communities. Some were motivated by loyalty, others by greed, and still others by the promise of freedom if they were slaves or captives. What united them was silence. They would vanish into foreign lands and never speak of their true purpose again. But recruitment went far beyond traders. Captured individuals, particularly those with valuable skills or positions, were often given a grim choice: serve as informants or perish. Many agreed, secretly funneling information back to their captors, while appearing to live as loyal subjects of their original rulers. This created a network of double lives, where friends and family might unknowingly share their deepest secrets with someone who was secretly working for the Vikings. Disguise was the lifeblood of Viking espionage. A spy who could not adapt to their surroundings would not survive for long. Unlike modern spies, who rely on documents and technology, Viking operatives had to become their roles completely, mastering languages, customs, and even belief systems. Some posed as monks, adopting the quiet humility and rituals of the Christian faith to move unnoticed through monasteries and churches. Others disguised themselves as humble craftsmen or servants, gaining access to castles and courts where warriors could never tread. There were even spies who traveled with Viking slave traders, blending into the human cargo they transported, appearing powerless while secretly observing everything around them. Women played a unique and powerful role in this system. While Viking warriors were mostly men, women could slip into spaces men could not: royal households, religious sanctuaries, even private chambers where rulers whispered their most guarded plans. Female spies often worked as entertainers, healers, or companions, using their positions to overhear conversations and influence decisions subtly. In many ways, they were the most dangerous agents of all, for no one suspected them until it was far too late. Unlike formal military forces, Viking spies didn't train in open camps or schools. Their preparation was secretive and personalized, passed down through oral tradition and hands-on experience. An aspiring spy might spend months shadowing a trader, learning how to ask questions without seeming curious, how to remember details without writing them down, and how to hide their true intentions beneath a mask of friendliness. They were also trained in survival skills, for their missions often took them deep into hostile territory. They learned to navigate by stars, to read tides and rivers, to forage for food when alone behind enemy lines. But perhaps their most important skill was storytelling. Vikings prized storytelling as a cultural art form, and spies used it as a weapon. A skilled operative could spin convincing lies, weaving narratives so seamless that even kings and priests believed them. These stories weren't just for cover identities. They were also tools of manipulation, subtly shaping the beliefs and fears of those around them. Some spies became masters of psychological warfare, spreading tales of monstrous Viking ships or cursed warriors that could not be defeated. Such legends traveled faster than armies, breaking enemy morale before a single blade was drawn. The Viking trading routes were vast and interconnected, stretching from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the glittering palaces of Byzantium and the bustling markets of Baghdad. These routes weren't just economic lifelines. They were the veins through which intelligence flowed. At key points along these routes, safe houses existed, inconspicuous taverns, docks, or private homes where spies could pass messages, exchange coded information, or rest before continuing their missions. Messages themselves were disguised in ingenious ways. A shipment of fish might contain a hollow bone holding a written scroll. A carved piece of jewelry might contain symbols that only the recipient could interpret. Even songs and poems were used as code, their verses carrying hidden meanings known only to the network. Because many Viking cultures relied heavily on oral tradition, this made decoding information even harder for enemies. A single wrong interpretation could mean disaster, and so every spy had to be both linguist and cryptographer, mastering the subtleties of language and symbolism. Some of history's most infamous Viking raids were not spontaneous acts of savagery, but carefully planned operations guided by intelligence work. One such example is the raid on Paris in 845 CE, led by the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure whose exploits would inspire centuries of myth and legend. While the saga tells of Ragnar's daring assault, what is often overlooked is how perfectly he exploited weaknesses in the city's defenses. Long before his fleet sailed up the Seine, Viking spies had been embedded in the region. They gathered information about guard rotations, flood patterns, and the city's political tensions. By the time Ragnar arrived, he knew exactly where to strike. The result was not just a victory, but a psychological blow so devastating that it forced the Franks to pay an enormous ransom to make him leave. Similar intelligence networks supported Viking activity in Ireland, England, and Russia. In many cases, the spies never returned home. They lived and died in foreign lands, their contributions erased from history, even as their work shaped the course of nations. The Vikings weren't the only ones who understood the value of spies. As their enemies grew wiser, they began to develop intelligence systems of their own. This led to a deadly game of counter-espionage, where loyalty could shift like the tide. Some Viking spies were discovered and turned into double agents, forced to feed false information back to their masters. Others willingly betrayed their chieftains, selling secrets to rival kingdoms for wealth or safety. This constant threat of betrayal forced the Vikings to create layers of secrecy. Even among spies, very few knew the full scope of an operation. One agent might know the time of an attack, while another knew the location, but neither would have both pieces of information. Only the Jarl or warlord at the top could see the complete picture, ensuring that even a captured spy couldn't unravel the entire network. Perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the Viking spy system was their mastery of psychological warfare. They didn't just gather intelligence. They used fear itself as a weapon. Before a raid, spies might spread terrifying rumors of invincible warriors or monstrous sea dragons pulling Viking ships. Villages would hear these stories and panic, often fleeing before the raiders even arrived. A single whisper, planted in the right place, could empty a stronghold without a single fight. This tactic amplified the Vikings' reputation across Europe. They weren't just raiders. They were living myths, their very names enough to send entire towns into chaos. And behind those myths were the spies, storytellers, and manipulators who understood that the mind is the greatest battlefield of all. By the late 9th century, Viking spy activity had reached its peak. Agents were embedded across Europe, from the courts of English kings to the distant markets of the Middle East. Some operated independently, passing information through a chain of traders and messengers that stretched for thousands of miles. Others worked directly under powerful jarls, serving as both informants and advisors. But with growth came vulnerability. The more people involved in the network, the greater the risk of exposure. Enemies began to adapt, creating traps and false information to ensnare Viking agents. What had once been a one-sided game of shadows was now becoming a true intelligence war, with spies fighting spies across the continent. As this chapter closes, the Viking spy network stands at the height of its power, but also on the brink of danger. Their methods have allowed them to dominate Europe's coastlines and strike fear into its rulers. But their enemies are learning, adapting, and preparing to strike back. In the next chapter, we will step into the deadliest missions ever undertaken by Viking spies, where single operatives decided the fate of entire kingdoms. These are the stories of betrayal, deception, and courage that even the sagas dared not tell. Missions where one wrong move meant not just death, but the destruction of an entire fleet and the collapse of a jarl's ambitions. For now, remember this. While Viking history is filled with roaring warriors and blazing ships, the true battles were often silent, fought by those whose names were never sung in the halls of their people, but whose shadows shaped the destiny of nations. As the 9th century dawned, Viking raids were no longer random strikes along Europe's coasts. They were precision attacks, guided by information gathered in silence, months or even years before the first longship ever touched the shore. These were not the deeds of berserkers alone, but of shadow warriors, unseen figures whose daring missions shaped the course of Viking expansion. Each mission was a gamble, a deadly dance of deception where one mistake could doom hundreds of warriors, or even the ambitions of an entire jarl. To understand the power of the Viking spy network, we must journey into the dark heart of their operations, where the lives of empires were decided by whispers in the night. One of the most chilling examples of Viking espionage comes from the early raids on Anglo-Saxon England. Among the prisoners taken during these raids were countless slaves, many of whom were sold into foreign markets, disappearing into households and monasteries far from their homelands. But some were not slaves at all. These individuals were deep cover operatives, posing as helpless captives while secretly gathering intelligence for their Norse masters. Their strategy was simple yet devastating: gain the trust of their captors, blend into the community, and quietly pass information to traders or other spies moving through the area. According to fragmented records, one such operative played a pivotal role in the capture of a fortified town in Northumbria. For years, he lived as a servant within the town's walls, silently observing its defenses and routines. When the time came, he left the gates unguarded on a stormy night, signaling the Viking raiding party to attack. By dawn, the settlement had fallen without a single warning horn sounded, a victory won not by strength of arms, but by a single silent betrayal. This mission demonstrated a key strength of the Viking network: patience. Unlike their battlefield tactics, which relied on speed and shock, their espionage operations unfolded slowly, like a creeping tide. The spies were willing to wait for years, knowing that the reward would be total domination when the moment came. The Siege of Paris. A masterclass in intelligence in 845 CE, Ragnar Lothbrok led one of the most legendary raids in Viking history, the assault on Paris. Popular stories paint Ragnar as a wild and fearless warrior, but beneath the legend lies a tale of careful planning and covert intelligence work. Long before Ragnar's fleet sailed up the Seine, Viking spies had been dispatched to infiltrate the region. Some posed as traders, others as mercenaries, offering their services to local lords. They studied the river's currents, the positions of watchtowers, and most crucially, the political tensions among the Frankish nobility. Their intelligence revealed that King Charles the Bald was struggling to maintain control over his vassals. The city of Paris was vulnerable, not just because of its physical defenses, but because of the divided loyalties within its leadership. Armed with this knowledge, Ragnar timed his attack perfectly, striking when the king's forces were scattered and morale was at its lowest. The result was a devastating victory. Ragnar's forces not only sacked parts of the city, but also forced Charles to pay an enormous ransom to secure their withdrawal. Without the spies who had prepared the ground, the raid could have been a disaster. Instead, it became a legend, proof that information is the sharpest blade of all. Not all Viking spy missions relied on brute force or open warfare. Some were operations of pure subtlety, where a single poisoned cup or whispered lie could achieve what armies could not. One saga tells of a Viking agent sent to the court of a rival Scandinavian king who was preparing to unite several clans against the Norse raiders. The spy entered the court disguised as a wandering skald, a traveling poet and storyteller. Through his songs and tales, he became a trusted entertainer of the court, privy to private conversations and political secrets. As tensions rose, he identified key figures who were pushing hardest for war against the Vikings. On a night of feasting, he slipped poison into the mead cups of two powerful chiefs. By dawn, they were dead, and the fragile alliance against the Norse had collapsed into chaos and suspicion. No battle was fought, no ships were launched. A single spy, armed only with wit and poison, had destroyed an enemy coalition before it was ever born. This mission illustrates how Viking spies operated on multiple levels, not just physical infiltration, but psychological manipulation, turning enemies against one another before the first axe was swung. Perhaps the most audacious mission of the Viking spy network involved religion, the most sacred and powerful force of the medieval world. In a region of what is now Ireland, Viking agents spread rumors of a wandering prophet who could interpret divine will and foretell the future. This prophet was, of course, a carefully trained operative, skilled in performance and deception. Over months, he gained the trust of local rulers and priests, subtly steering their decisions to benefit the Vikings. When a crucial fortress needed to be weakened, he declared that the gods demanded its gates be left open for a sacred ritual. When a rival king needed to be distracted, he prophesied a false invasion to draw troops away from their true target. The brilliance of this mission lay in its invisible nature. No one suspected espionage because the manipulations appeared to come from divine inspiration. By the time the truth was uncovered, the Vikings had already taken what they needed and vanished, leaving behind only confusion and shattered faith. These stories showcase the extraordinary reach and cunning of the Viking spy network, but they also reveal its greatest weakness: paranoia. As the network grew, so did the risk of exposure. A single captured agent could unravel entire operations, putting fleets and settlements in danger. To counter this, Viking leaders relied on strict compartmentalization. Spies rarely knew the identities of their fellow operatives, and messages were passed through coded songs, symbols carved into wood, or even tattoos hidden beneath clothing. This secrecy protected the network, but it also isolated the spies themselves. Many operatives lived double lives for so long that they lost their sense of identity. Were they Vikings, traders, monks, or something else entirely? When the final mission was complete, some never returned home, choosing to vanish into the foreign lands they had once infiltrated. For them, the spy's life was not just a role. It had become their only reality. By the close of the 9th century, Viking spies had achieved unprecedented successes. Entire kingdoms were brought to their knees through a combination of terror, manipulation, and precise strikes. But their enemies were learning. Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and Irish rulers began developing their own networks of informants, setting traps for Viking operatives and planting double agents within the Norse ranks. What had once been a one-sided game of shadows was now becoming a two-front war, fought not just with swords and ships, but with lies and secrets. In the next and final chapter, we will witness the decline and transformation of the Viking spy network. We will see how these once invisible agents were forced to adapt, how some turned against their masters, and how their methods shaped the future of European espionage for centuries to come. The age of the Viking spies was ending, but their legacy was only just beginning. The 10th century dawned with the roar of Viking war horns still echoing across the coasts of Europe. But beneath the thunder of raids and battles, something quieter was happening. The whispers were fading. For nearly 2 centuries, Viking spies had been the unseen hands that guided invasions, manipulated kings, and ensured that raiders struck with impossible precision. Their work had turned a loose network of Norse clans into the terror of Christendom. But no network, no matter how secretive, can remain invisible forever. The enemies who once trembled before the Vikings were now learning their game, and they were ready to fight back, not just with armies, but with spies of their own. The success of the Viking spy network had forced kingdoms like the Franks, Anglo-Saxons, and Irish to evolve. At first, their defenses were simple: fortify towns, build watchtowers, and strengthen armies. But as they began to realize the true source of Viking power, they shifted their focus from walls to information. Kings established their own intelligence councils, recruiting monks, traders, and even criminals to act as informants. These agents were tasked with identifying Viking spies, spreading false rumors, and feeding disinformation back to Norse warlords. It was a dangerous game, a war of lies layered atop the war of blades and shields. Soon, Viking spies who once operated freely found themselves walking into traps. Safe houses were exposed. False alliances were dangled like bait. Some agents were captured alive, tortured until they revealed their contacts, leading to devastating purges within the network. The balance of power was shifting. For the first time, the Vikings were no longer the hunters. They were becoming the hunted. As external pressures mounted, internal cracks began to form. The loyalty of Viking spies had always been fragile, built on promises of gold, power, or freedom, rather than ideology. When the risks began to outweigh the rewards, some operatives turned traitor, selling their knowledge to rival kingdoms or rival Viking factions. One of the most infamous cases involved a spy embedded in the court of an Anglo-Saxon king. For years, he had supplied intelligence to his Norse masters, enabling raids that devastated the countryside. But when he was offered land and wealth in exchange for switching sides, he betrayed his network, revealing the identities of multiple agents. Entire operations were compromised overnight. These betrayals sent shockwaves through the Viking leadership. Trust, always scarce among spies, became nearly impossible. Even successful missions were now shadowed by suspicion. Was the information accurate? Or was it a trap? Could the messenger be relied upon? Or was he a double agent waiting to strike? The paranoia that once protected the network now began to tear it apart from within. The final blow to Viking espionage came from an unlikely source: King Alfred of Wessex, later known as Alfred the Great. Alfred understood that defeating the Vikings required more than just soldiers. He needed to beat them at their own game, in the realm of shadows. Under Alfred's leadership, Wessex developed a sophisticated network of scouts, informants, and counter-spies. He deployed agents disguised as peasants and traders to infiltrate Viking-controlled territories, gathering intelligence on troop movements and planned raids. At the same time, he launched campaigns of disinformation, feeding false reports to Norse spies and manipulating their strategies. One of Alfred's most brilliant moves was to create decoy settlements, seemingly rich, poorly defended villages that were actually heavily fortified traps. When Viking raiders attacked these targets, they were ambushed and destroyed. The psychological impact was immense. Suddenly, the invincible Vikings could no longer trust their own intelligence network. Every piece of information became suspect, every opportunity potentially fatal. This was the beginning of the end. The Viking spy network, once a silent storm, was now collapsing under the weight of lies, betrayal, and relentless counterattacks. By the dawn of the 11th century, the Viking Age was waning. Their fleets still sailed, their warriors still fought, but the mystique of invincibility was gone. Without their spies to prepare the way, raids became riskier, costlier, and less effective. As kingdoms united and grew stronger, the Vikings were slowly pushed back, their empire of shadows reduced to fragments. Yet even as their network crumbled, the methods they pioneered lived on. The very kingdoms that had once been their victims now used Viking techniques to build modern intelligence systems. The practice of embedding spies in foreign courts, of spreading disinformation, of waging psychological warfare, all of these strategies began with the Norse shadow agents. In this way, the Vikings shaped not just the battlefields of their time, but the very concept of espionage itself. The secret wars fought today in boardrooms, back alleys, and government offices owe a silent debt to those ancient agents who first walked among their enemies unseen. Even centuries later, traces of the Viking spy network linger in the archaeological record and in the sagas whispered by skalds. A carved runestone depicting cryptic symbols, a fragment of a coded song passed down through generations, a mysterious burial where a warrior lies beside tools not of war, but of deception, false coins, hidden compartments, and strange markings no one can fully decipher. These fragments remind us that while the battles of the past may be over, their secrets endure. The Viking spies may be gone, but their shadows remain, influencing how we think about war, strategy, and power to this very day. As our journey through the hidden world of Viking espionage comes to an end, consider this. History is rarely shaped by the loudest voices or the brightest fires. More often, it is shaped by those who move unseen, whose actions are never recorded, whose names are never sung. The Vikings understood this truth, and for a time, they ruled the world not just with swords and ships, but with secrets. The next time you hear the roar of a Viking battle cry in movies or games, remember the quieter, deadlier war that made those victories possible, a war fought in silence and darkness by men and women who lived and died in the shadows. If you've enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, join our community of truth seekers and history hunters by subscribing to Ancient Spy Files. Hit the like button, share this story with friends, and tell us in the comments where you're re-watching from and what time it is right now. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light, stories that reveal the secret currents beneath the tides of history. Because while battles may end, the war of secrets never truly dies.